thank you first and foremost for joining us today. It's lovely. By way of introductions, we kind of discussed a little bit beforehand, but obviously I knew your father, Philip, I think in 2012 was when you first came through the support groups, and I think your brother-in-law had actually made contact through the annual seminar prior to that. But just by way of making the audience sort of familiar with you, you could perhaps just tell us a little bit about who you are and kind of what you're up to at this point in life before we talk about where you've been.
My name's Will. I'm a second-year Spanish student at Liverpool University. And I went to before that I went to boarding school, so I've been sort of doing bits and bobs. Really.
My name's Ed. I'm a second-year student at Leeds University, and I went to boarding school with Will and had a gap year, which unfortunately I had planned to go away, but at the end I ended up staying at home for most of it with my mum, who was the one suffering from dementia at the time. So my gap year I spent a lot of the time I was with her around the house and that sort of thing, and that's where I've got most of my experience from, because obviously being away at boarding school, I wasn't always at home. She phoned me every now and then, but I wasn't always in contact with her. But it was my gap year where I really spent most time and had the most experience and probably learned the most about what it was affecting her.
First and foremost, in case you're wondering how they're both doing their second year at university, they are twins. I'm Philip Grant. I originally qualified as a lawyer, but nobody's perfect. But I spent most of my working life in the city, working in the insurance sector. I gave up my full-time work at the end of 2013 because at the time I thought I would need to spend pretty much all of the time looking after Liza, my wife, the boy's mother. Sadly, the condition moved on relatively quickly, and she went into care in March of last year. So I now do a couple of non-exec bits and pieces, little bits of charity work, and I'm studying for an Open University degree, so it's a wonderful life.
And knowing, as you do now, obviously, that your mother, your wife, Liza, has a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia, how long do you say the signs were developing before the diagnosis came? How long previously would there be a cause for concern as you look back?
I think, strangely, that the further on one gets, the further back I look and see the signs of what was to come. I suppose at the very least it was 3 or 4 years before Liza was diagnosed, which was at the end of 2011. Looking right back to the time when we were sort of 50-ish, I suppose. Just the signs of a lack of emotional engagement, the starts of some fairly obsessive behaviour, I suppose, repetitive sayings, that sort of stuff. I think the boys probably noticed things as well. It might be worth asking them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as my dad said, the more you look back, you start piecing together and you'll recognise smaller and smaller details that might have caused it. But obviously, with my mum, it was obviously her character anyway. So as long as I can remember, she was always kind of a bit eccentric and that sort of thing. So it's kind of hard to realise. It's kind of hard to realise exactly when that goes from just normal sort of eccentricity to actually sort of the early signs of the symptoms and that sort of thing. But obviously, looking back, there were sort of times when we'd be in the car with her driving and that sort of thing, and she'd get sort of unusually angry about sort of small things. And we all get sort of unusually angry sometimes, especially when people are driving. But it's sort of you look at it and you realise that wasn't quite a normal response and not something wasn't quite right back then. Also, there was an interaction with other people. She was always been the embarrassing parent, but then that turned into when you sort of looking back, you're realising that maybe she didn't always, she was oblivious to the fact that how to interact with people and that sort of thing, and she'd say inappropriate things that obviously now we know why she was saying the thing, but at the time, obviously you're not thinking it doesn't spring to mind. You're just thinking, oh, she said that, oh, that's embarrassing. Then you just get over it. But then looking back, I'd say it was about 4 or 5 years before the actual diagnosis, we started seeing things that weren't quite right, and we'd have arguments. She'd say things, and we'd be arguing. She wouldn't be sort of defending her case. She'd have an idea that was probably wrong or sort of illogical in some way, and she wouldn't actually argue it. She'd just sort of stubbornly stick by it without sort of trying to fight her case. She just wouldn't want to change her mind and things like that. I remember we had sort of a few arguments where we just keep going back and forth, and she wouldn't be sort of open to changing her mind and that sort of thing.
Sure.
Yeah, so following from that point, because we were away for quite a while, because of boarding schools, we were off, and we only came back sort of for a couple of weeks at a time. But when just stuff like when she come to pick us up from school, and looking back on it, we, as you said, we just brushed it off as her just being a bit eccentric, sort of, being a bit embarrassing. But it's when we realised that, because usually if someone's being embarrassing, there's a time and place to switch it off. But obviously she wasn't doing that. And then looking back, we noticed a lot of things she used to say, really inappropriate stuff. She used to just sort of make inappropriate jokes, or she never sort of find anything. The times when you need to be serious, she'd never find it serious. She'd be laughing about it and stuff like that. So looking back, it was definitely going on for a while before the actual diagnosis.
Yeah. Thank you. As the mother of 3 teenage children, I think being embarrassing comes with part of the territory of having teenage children. But I guess and understand that what you're referring to is over and above the sort of norm that sadly is inflicted upon parents of teenagers. I just wondered if you might touch upon, just because we did earlier in one of the talks hear about the weight gain, and I remember you talking quite clearly about Liza and her fitness regime and her ability to run, and I just thought that was an interesting pull from what we've heard earlier.
Yeah, I mean, Liza ran two London marathons. The second one, with hindsight, when she was clearly beginning to show the symptoms of the FTD. She kept pretty fit, but despite that, and without seeming on the face of it to eat much more than she used to, she just started putting on a huge amount of weight, and that process has continued. And she's now in a care home, and they've got her on a pretty careful diet. So it's bananas, not biscuits, with the coffee, and a very sensibly managed diet, but the weight is shaken off, and so we don't know what that is. She still gets a reasonable amount of exercise.
And as we've heard today also, misdiagnoses along the way are typical, and the consequences of these are often hugely significant for people, ranging from sort of loss of jobs to marriage breakdowns and tensions as a result of misunderstanding, behavioural changes. I just wondered if you would comment a little bit on perhaps your journey to diagnosis with Liza, with your mum.
It was a difficult journey, I think, because first and foremost because there was a lot of hostility from Liza towards me during the year or so before we got a proper diagnosis, and so she was very resistant to suggestions that I made that something was wrong. Fortunately, Jamie, my brother-in-law, Liza's brother, and I sort of conspired benevolently, because we both realised, I think, about the same sort of time there was something pretty seriously wrong, and so we were convinced that she needed to go to the doctor. I think the second problem was that because she went along to the doctor on her own the first time, she could make a pretty plausible conversation and a pretty plausible case that there was nothing wrong. She wasn't lying. She didn't think anything was wrong particularly, but I think, and I attach no blame at all to our GP, who's been marvellous since then. But I think she just fell for it, and so I think the initial diagnosis was probably menopausal or something like that, nothing more. Obviously, as the symptoms intensified, and Jamie and I became more and more concerned, we decided the best thing to do was to make a note of our concerns, document them, and we wrote a jointly composed letter to Liza's GP. And on that occasion, Jamie was able to go with Liza because she refused to let me go with her. And that was enough to raise the storm cones, I think, as far as our GP was concerned. From that point on, we were then referred to a neurologist and an MRI scan and also a lumbar puncture later on, which confirmed the diagnosis. So from there on, the diagnostic process went relatively smoothly. But I think it's from other people I've spoken to, it's pretty typical that in the early stages, the symptoms are not easy to discern, and quite often people are quite plausible in the stories they can tell.
And we'll hold the story there in terms of diagnosis, but just in terms of responding to a diagnosis yourselves when it came, obviously you get an explanation for why some of the behaviours that you'd seen in your stand. How did you respond individually to those diagnoses?
Obviously, when it came through, obviously I didn't understand what it was. Obviously, I had a very basic understanding of what dementia was at the time, and didn't really it obviously didn't register fully at first. I mean, obviously, it did explain, because I thought at the time I thought dementia was just sort of the memory loss side of things, and that's what the first signs were. Because the behavioural stuff came later on, so it was kind of a memory loss sort of thing. So I thought, okay, it explains the memory loss. It didn't register. Firstly, that it was degenerative. I thought that that explains about that. That's just. I thought I didn't know the gravity of what would eventually happen. So at the time I was told about diagnosis, I was thinking, that explains the memory loss, but we can help with that. We can look after her and keep a close eye on her. And I didn't. Obviously, it took a bit of time to register that it was degenerative. I think it was the first time, because obviously when it wasn't a sort of gradual transition. It was like when the first time she really kind of took a step down, not a turn for the worse, and then you realise that it is getting worse, and it's things are changing and that sort of thing. So that's when it really sort of hit home what the actual cause. Also, I found out a bit more about it, learned a bit more about it, obviously, to know what was happening. So then that kind of prompted more of a reaction when I realised exactly what was happening, rather than I thought it was just memory loss. But then when I looked more into it, I realised what was happening, and then from that started to notice and kind of lined up what I'd been reading about it with what was actually happening, and I sort of put two and two together and realised that was happening, and then it kind of hit home a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we were first told about it, sort of what was happening, because I was relatively young, 16, 17, so I knew a lot of weird stuff had been happening, but I kind of thought it was just Mum being eccentric, and I hadn't really sort of linked it all together. And then when Dad told us what was the problem, I still didn't know a lot about it, because obviously back then I was really in the dark about the whole thing. Basically, back then I was on the impression that Alzheimer's dementia is something that happens to elderly people, and they sort of get a bit forgetful. I didn't obviously know about sort of all the behavioural aspects and stuff like that. So at the time, I did think maybe I did clock on a bit and thought, this explains why she's done this and that, but I didn't really know obviously how the severity of what it was and what was going to happen sort of down the line. But I mean, it was a bit of a shock at first. It took me a while to sort of comprehend it as such, and sort of get to grips with what it actually meant in the long run, stuff like that.
I think it's fair to say we found it difficult to talk about as a family for some time afterwards, and I hope Will won't mind me reflecting a conversation we had a few weeks ago when he said that the most difficult thing about all of this has been the inability to talk with Liza about this, because certainly ever since we've known what it is that we had to talk about, she hasn't been able to talk about it because of her lack of insight into her own condition. And I think with any other serious life-threatening condition, however awful it is, you would hope to have the opportunity to sit down as a family and discuss the future. We've never had that opportunity, and it's been really, really tough for us.
And I think when we were talking prior to today, Philip raised a really important point that you can't judge when the right time will come for people to talk. So sometimes people's reaction is a quest for information, a quest for understanding, but the importance of needing to talk through what this diagnosis means for you is hugely important and comes at different times for different people. One or two practical points, Philip, that you raised in terms of responding to a diagnosis was sort of focusing on how important it was to tell other people about the diagnosis.
Yes, we live in a village, and Liza's initial diagnosis was made in September after the MRI scan, and whilst it was a huge shock, I thought it was the right thing to do, to tell people, friends, family obviously, but friends in the village as well. And what surprised me was the sense of relief that I got from most people. Thank God, that's what it is, because, I mean, explanations in the village, as you can imagine, varied. It was like an episode of The Archers. Everybody was speculating what was up with Liza, varying from a marital breakdown, which in truth was not an implausible thing, because it did affect our marriage very severely, through to that she was hitting the bottle. Once people knew that it was a condition, that it was a dementia, however shocked and saddened they were by it, it explained it for them, and that made life, I think, easier for people in our local community to deal with. So I think the recommendation is to tell people about it. I mean, on an official level as well. I mean, I can't overemphasize the importance of getting a power of attorney in place while you still can. It's been immensely helpful, because Liza, and I'm sure everybody else who gets this, is easy prey for the spammers and the con men and the chancers. You can stop that because you can control bank accounts, and it doesn't mean you necessarily circumscribe, at least initially, the activities of the person, but it does mean that you know what's going on. And secondly, we had very good contacts with our local police force, who took a picture of Liza and for their records. The local constables in Bishop Stortford, near where we live, and in the village, all knew what it was. They scooped her off the A10 a couple of times when she decided it would be a good idea to walk down the bypass to go and see her friend in Hertford. So, you know, I think tell people about it, because the more people that know about it, the more they can help.
And I know from what you've said, you've had a lot of support from family and community. But one of the things that really struck me when we were talking was how, when you mentioned about some people's uneasiness in terms of how to respond to you as the sort of single partner of Liza. So whether they would invite both of you to an event, or whether it was okay to invite you. And you also upon how it was difficult. It was a very emotional and behaviour-based sort of set of symptoms, whether people could talk to you about that.
Yeah, I think people responded in a very English way, if you like, which is to say that they were bursting with offers of help, and a lot of that help was very practically delivered. But in terms of engaging with me on a more emotional level, they found that much more difficult, I think. And yes, on the practical level, I mean, the dinner party invitations dried up because they didn't know whether to invite one of us or two of us, or what to do. And so when it's awkward, you tend to do nothing. It didn't mean they were less friendly towards me, they were less keen to see me or anything, but it just meant that they were a little more diffident about approaching me and talking about things. And that's improved as time has gone on, but initially it was very tough. I don't know whether the boys want to talk about how their school friends dealt with it as well.
Yeah, school friends, because obviously at boarding school, when she come pick us up and things like that, when she come up, like, you know, it's a very public thing, and everyone sees, and she'd be saying things, and the filter would be completely gone, so she'd be saying inappropriate things. And to a degree, the school kids, once they knew about it, once I found out about it, I told my housemaster at the time, and sort of people asked me about it, I'd openly let them know, because I didn't see any point in sort of concealing it or kind of keeping it in. So because if my friends knew, then obviously they'd know what was happening, and they would, you know, they'd know how to react. And so I had a great response from them. They knew, and when she would come up to see me and things like that, she'd say things to them that if they didn't know what was going on, they would react probably, and, you know, they might have reacted in a bad way. They kind of just laugh and say, oh, she said this, whatever, I don't mind. And everyone just kind of, they weren't too kind of like, they didn't go over the top with it when they heard about it. They weren't sort of, you know, treading on eggshells. It was kind of very, very natural. But they just sort of, when she said something inappropriate, they brush it off and probably laugh and that sort of thing, go along with it. And it's basically just kind of react and just not trying to, obviously not take anything, if they said anything, not take anything too personally. And if I was upset about it, they'd know what to do, and they'd react really well. The same, obviously, my uni friends. She never came. By the time I went to uni, she wouldn't have. So she never came up to uni with me when we were moving in. So my uni hasn't haven't met her, but in terms of they know my situation, and if they ask me about it, I will tell them about it and give them information, because, you know, obviously it does affect me if I have a bad day for whatever reason. Especially when I first moved up to uni, because I spent the whole year with her pretty much. So moving away from that was tough, and people saw it and they'd see me upset, and they'd know why. And so rather than like sort of questioning, oh, what's wrong, and wondering, they'd know what was wrong, sure, and, you know, respond in a sort of appropriate way and that sort of thing, which is all I could really ask from them.
You really make the point well that it's worth and important to tell people, and I think it's also worth noting that sometimes people's response is not as you expect. So it can be the people who you think will help most, who don't, and the people who you least expect to step up to the plate, who become the real support.
Exactly, yeah. One thing about it was obviously I told people about it because I said, it's about my mum and things like that. People for a bit, some people got very cagey about talking about family when I was in the room and things like that, which obviously I didn't want to happen. I didn't want anyone to feel that uncomfortable talking about anything around me. Obviously, and I'm not going to sort of, obviously. It would hit me, but I'm not going to sort of I don't want anyone to be any different around me as a result of it. I want people to talk freely about it, even if they're interested, ask me questions. Because when my dad was on the TV, my dad was on Channel 4 News, and it's gone bright red. He's on Channel 4 News, and my friends all watched it. Just to sort of get just a bit more information about it, really, because they're genuinely and they'd ask me about it, and I'd openly tell them what they wanted to know to the best of my ability, because I didn't want to keep internalize it all and that sort of thing, because I knew that my friends and I could trust them, and they can, some of them they've had similar experiences in their life as well, so we can sort of share it and just basically help each other and that sort of thing. So I found like the more I shared it, the more comfortable people were around me and that sort of thing, because they didn't feel like I was kind of trying to keep anything away or like hiding away from anything. They felt if I was open with them, then they feel more comfortable about talking about it and sort of getting along with it in a house.
Yeah, like when I told people at school, sort of, because there was only it was the relatively early stages, and because she was still driving and everything, and she was always a bit sort of she'd always been a bit sort of embarrassing when she came up, but obviously when it started going on, I sort of all my friends and all the teachers and stuff at school knew. So if she did anything, obviously they'd know that's why, and sort of they just sort of laugh along with it or whatever. But I was, and same as Ed, obviously she's never been up to uni, but all my uni friends know what's going on, and especially if I do tell them, like, if I have them having a hard time, they sort of understand, and I'll go to them or whatever. But a lot of them, it took some of them a while to sort of understand what I was going on about, because I told them what was happening. I said, yeah, my mum's got dementia. In hindsight, I probably should have said early onset, because they all thought hang about it, but she's, and I was like, yeah, they're like, how old is she? Like 57. She's like, well, they got, all right. But it took understanding me, because I didn't know about it until it all started happening. So it took them a while to sort of grasp hold of the concept of it. But then when they sort of understood, and they've all sort of, but yeah, people were, as Ed said, people were a bit cagey and a bit sort of stand backish to talk about it at first. Like they'd all say that some of my friends would say, oh yeah, I'm going to go home for my mum's birthday, and they'd be like, oh, sorry, Will, sorry, I didn't mean that. I was like, right, okay. Yeah. But like they sort of they've gradually sort of they've gradually sort of understood it, and then they're fine with it now. But they were at the first time, they were a bit sort of standoffish and a bit sort of don't mention it. Don't talk about it, whatever.
Thank you. To move things kind of into a different realm and talk a little bit about practical provision that arrived after the diagnosis was achieved. Can you share with us your experience?
Yeah, I mean, the most significant thing that happened the day after diagnosis was absolutely nothing, which I mean, I've described it as being, you have to first realise there's a jigsaw, then find the pieces and assemble them, and only then do you realise what the picture is. Now, that may not be typical of other areas, because I'm aware that the NHS is pretty tribal, but I really we had to pull it together ourselves and find out what was going on. And when I did access some services, they were generally listed on the websites under elderly care services, Alzheimer's, whatever. I mean, I accept that it's a relatively rare condition, but it's not so rare that there should be no understanding, particularly within specialist mental health units. Has this thing switched itself off? Okay. So I think the first few weeks, months after diagnosis were very, very hard, because there was no real professional support other than what I was able to access. I have to say that organisations like the Alzheimer's Society were marvellous, because there were people there who would tell me what was going on. But if you think you will receive a visit from somebody or a phone call the day after diagnosis saying this is what's going to happen next, then that's not the way things are. But then I'm sure most people in this room know that already.
And you kindly agreed when we talked about this session to bring us up to date in terms of where Liza sort of is at the moment in terms of her health and her care needs. But in so doing, you talked about various points along the way that were sort of either stress points or points of relief. The first was diagnosis.
Yeah. I think that's right. It is the first was diagnosis, because then you know what it is. And if this doesn't sound too emotional, it reminded me of my wedding vows. We had a pretty tough time in our marriage before that, because I described the behaviour and the things that went on to all sorts of different sources. But once I knew it was an illness, then it brought me back and was a relief in that sense. We gradually got more care in for Liza. It started off with ad hoc care, and then finally we got to the point where we thought we needed a full-time carer for her, and we had a lovely Aussie lady who came over and looked after her for a few months. But slowly that proved to be inadequate as well. I think Liza was very anxious, very upset by being at home. Something deep inside was telling her that it was not the place, she didn't want to be there. And we finally, and reluctantly, it was a difficult decision, but decided that she should go into residential care. It was a decision I hated making, and it was a decision I feared, but actually, with hindsight, it was precisely the right decision, because she took to it like a duck to water. I'm not being prescriptive. Different people have different ways of dealing with things, but I certainly think that it's something one should never rule out, however noble one's motives about looking after somebody at home right the way through. That may not necessarily be the right thing for you as the carer, because it can be exhausting, but it may not also be the right thing for the person you're caring for, because they may be distressed. And I think the signs of distress that we noticed in Liza in the last month or two, when the full-time carer was there, and I talked about it a lot with our carer, sucking through the teeth, grinding of teeth, the sort of typical signs of anxiety and aggression were increasing rather than subsiding. And from the day she moved into her care home, those symptoms subsided, and she's been happy within the limited frame of that word ever since she's been in care, which is now getting on for a year.
Thank you. And if it's appropriate to sort of round things up, I hope I don't speak out of place when I sort of mentioned that I think the terms that we talked about previous to today were how you commented that it was in some ways difficult. You felt that you were grieving in some ways for the person you lost, but whilst that person, of course, was still alive. And that's a very difficult place to find, for any of us to find ourselves in. So I think that really is a measure of how brave it is to come and sit here in front of an audience like this and share your story in the midst of that reality. And Philip, you used 3 lovely words. You said that we have tranquility.
I think we do now. Liza's in the right place. She's being properly looked after. We all of us have our good days and our bad days, and days when we can deal with it better than others. But I think knowing that we're doing the right thing, I think has certainly given me tranquility, and I hope Ed and Will feel the same way.
Thank you.
Okay then. Well, thank you very much.